National parks are built to preserve the wild. Boundaries are marked. Trails are mapped. Rangers patrol landscapes meant to be explored, but also respected. Every year, millions of people enter these places and return safely. But some don't. Welcome to True Crime Maps. This episode examines the disappearance of Jaryd Atadero, a case that unfolded in the mountains of Colorado, where a child separated from a hiking group and was never seen alive again, despite an extensive search and years of unanswered questions. October 2nd, 1999. A 3-year-old boy vanished in the mountains of northern Colorado. His name was Jaryd Atadero. He disappeared along a hiking trail called the Big South Trail. The trail runs through the Arapahoe and Roosevelt National Forest. Hundreds of searchers entered the canyon. Tracking dogs followed the trail. Helicopters searched the forest from above. The mountains gave nothing back. 4 years later, pieces of clothing would be discovered high above the trail, scattered across a steep slope of broken rock. And even today, no one can say with certainty what happened to Jaryd Atadero. Jaryd Jeffrey Atadero was born January 2, 1996. He lived in Littleton, Colorado with his father, Alan Atadero, and his sister, Jocelyn Atadero. Friends describe Jaryd as energetic, curious, always smiling, the kind of child who explored everything, the kind of child who held your hand when he walked. He loved Star Wars toys. He loved the movie Tarzan. And on the day he disappeared, he was wearing small white Tarzan sneakers. In early October 1999, the Atadero family traveled north into the Rocky Mountains. They were staying at the Poudre River Resort. The resort sits deep inside Poudre Canyon, along the Cache La Poudre River. The canyon is narrow. Steep forested slopes rise on both sides. Once you enter the canyon, there are very few ways out. On the morning of October 2nd, members of a Christian singles group organized a day trip. The original plan was simple: visit a nearby fish hatchery. But when the group arrived in the canyon, they made a different decision. Instead, they would take a hike. The trail they chose was the Big South Trail, a rugged wilderness trail following the Big South Fork of the Cache La Poudre River. The trail winds through dense forest, rocky slopes, and narrow canyon walls. It is a beautiful wilderness, but it is not a place for a toddler to wander alone. As the group moved along the trail, the hikers naturally spread out. Some walked faster, others stayed behind. At some point, Jaryd ran ahead up the trail. 2 fishermen sitting near Camp 2 noticed the small boy approaching. Jaryd asked them a question. He asked, "Are there bears around here?" The fishermen could see hikers coming up the trail behind him, so they assumed the child belonged to them. They watched Jaryd walk north along the trail. That was the last confirmed sighting of Jaryd. A short time later, a scream echoed through the canyon. Jaryd's sister later described the sound. She said it might have been playful, or it might have been someone being attacked. At first, the hikers believed Jaryd had simply run farther ahead, but when they reached the next section of trail, he was gone. The group searched the trail for nearly an hour. Then 2 members ran back down the canyon. They went to notify Jaryd's father. When Alan heard the news, his reaction was immediate. He screamed, "They lost my baby." Alan drove to the trailhead and began searching himself, calling Jaryd's name into the forest. Soon the sheriff's office was notified, and a massive search operation began. More than 200 searchers joined the effort: tracking dogs, professional trackers, dive teams searching the river, helicopters scanning the mountains from above. The terrain was unforgiving: steep slopes, dense forest, rocky talus fields. But everyone believed the same thing. They believed they would find a frightened child nearby. But hour after hour passed with no sign of Jaryd. In the hours after Jaryd disappeared, word began to spread beyond Poudre Canyon. At first, it was a local news story for television crews from Fort Collins and Denver. Then the story began to travel farther. In news parlance, it had legs. A 3-year-old boy lost in the mountains captured national attention. Soon, the canyon filled with cameras. Satellite trucks parked along the narrow highway. Reporters broadcasting live from the edge of the forest. For Jaryd's father, the attention was overwhelming, but he hoped the publicity might help. Someone might have seen something. Someone might come forward with information. Instead, the attention created a different kind of problem. As the story spread, strangers began arriving in Poudre Canyon. People who had no connection to a search or to the family. Some claimed to have psychic abilities. They said they could feel where Jaryd was. They pointed search teams toward random places in the mountains. Others came simply out of curiosity, drawn by the tragedy unfolding in the canyon. Search officials were forced to spend valuable time turning people away, managing crowds, and separating legitimate volunteers from those who were interfering with the search. False tips began arriving from across the country in the form of phone calls and letters, describing sightings that could not possibly be real. But each one had to be investigated. Each one consumed time and energy during the critical first days of the search. For the family, the attention quickly became a nightmare. Rumors began circulating, and speculation filled television broadcasts as strangers debated the fate of Jaryd on national news. Meanwhile, search crews continued combing the canyon, the trail, and the treacherous slopes above the river. They hoped that the next ridge or the next stand of trees might reveal a clue, but the mountains remained silent. Then the search suffered a devastating setback. On October 3rd, a United States Air Force Huey helicopter joined the search, but during operations, the aircraft crashed into the mountainside. All 5 people aboard were injured, including a volunteer searcher named Mark Sheets. The crash severely complicated the search effort, but teams continued searching the canyon. For 6 days, searchers combed the canyon. Still, there were no clues, no footprints, no clothing, no calls for help. On October 8th, the official search was suspended. Jaryd had vanished. Nearly 4 years passed. Then in June 2003, 2 hikers made a disturbing discovery. High above the trail on a steep talus slope, more than 500 feet above the canyon floor, they found pieces of clothing scattered across the rocks. A brown fleece pullover, blue sweatpants turned completely inside out, and small white Tarzan sneakers. Jaryd's shoes. 10 days later, investigators returned to the site. Nearby, they discovered a small human molar and a fragment of skull bone. DNA testing confirmed the remains belonged to Jaryd Atadero, but the discovery raised more questions than answers. Authorities eventually concluded the most likely explanation was a mountain lion attack. Cougar tracks had reportedly been found near the trail, and mountain lions are capable of silently carrying prey across steep and rugged terrain. But several details did not perfectly match that theory. There was no blood on the clothing, no confirmed predator DNA, and the sweatpants had been turned completely inside out. Because of those details, some investigators questioned whether a mountain lion was truly responsible. Others suggested the possibility of a different animal predator. Possibilities included coyotes or even black bears. But Jaryd's father, Alan Atadero, believed another possibility had not been fully explored. He believed his son may have encountered not an animal predator, but a human predator. Despite years of investigation, however, no suspect was ever identified. No definitive predator was confirmed, and no explanation fully accounted for all of the evidence. Eventually, the case was closed. The official cause of death remains undetermined. In the years that followed, Alan devoted himself to keeping his son's memory alive. He wrote books about the case and advocated for improvements in missing child response systems. Colorado later implemented the Amber Alert system, something Alan strongly supported. For the rest of his life, he carried the weight of the mystery. He once described the grief as a pebble in your shoe that never goes away. He spent decades searching for answers, trying to understand what happened on that trail in Poudre Canyon, but the answers never came. In 2025, Jaryd Atadero passed away, more than 25 years after his son disappeared. He died still carrying the same question that began on the Big South Trail. What happened to my boy? And the mountains of Poudre Canyon never answered him. More than 25 years later, the disappearance of Jaryd Atadero remains one of the most haunting mysteries in the Rocky Mountains. A child vanishes from a trail. A massive search reveals nothing. And years later, only fragments are discovered high above the canyon. The Big South Trail still winds through Poudre Canyon today, past the campsites, past the river, past the steep slopes rising above the trail. The forest has grown thicker. The seasons have turned again and again. Winter snow, spring runoff, summer sun, autumn leaves falling across the path. Hikers still walk that trail. Backpackers, fishermen, families with children. Most pass through the canyon without ever knowing what happened there. They cross the same bridges. They follow the same narrow path along the river. They pass the same campsites where searchers once gathered hoping for a sign. Somewhere above the trail, the slopes rise sharply into the forest. Rock fields, tall pines, steep ridges that disappear into the mountains. It was somewhere in that wilderness that the last pieces of Jaryd's story were found. But the rest of that story was never discovered. For more than 25 years, the mountains of Poudre Canyon have kept that secret. Storms have passed through the canyon. Snow has covered the trail. Rivers have flooded and receded. And still the question remains, what happened to Jaryd? Somewhere in those mountains the answer exists, hidden among the forests, the rocks, the quiet places far above the trail. But the canyon has never given that answer back, and the silence of Big South Trail continues.